Hello, and welcome to the Denver Democracy Series, the first in a series of conversations on the state of democracy around the world and in the United States that lead up to our fourth annual Denver Democracy Summit in January. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver. Thanks for joining us today. You know, democracy is about as important a topic as there is these days, and certainly very important to all of us at the Korbel School. It's kind of in our DNA. Joseph Korbel, famously the father of Madeleine Albright and professor of Condoleezza Rice, really set the tone for the school. And it's always been a central issue for all of us here at the Korbel School, and certainly is today. Before we go too far, let me thank our partners and supporters in this project. We really appreciate their support. So they include the Atlantic Council and the DFR Lab at the Atlantic Council, Freedom House, the National Civic League, Democracy Innovation, International IDEA, League of Women Voters of Colorado, Thank You Democracy, the Global Democracy Coalition, and the Gates Family Foundation based here in Denver. Thank you all to our partners and supporters. I mentioned the Denver Democracy Summit, and that this would be our fourth. You know, we actually began this series of summits before the 2020 election. Little did we know that it would fall shortly after the events of January 6th, and really reinforcing the timeliness of the topic, certainly for all of us in the United States. The summit has become, I think, one of the leading gatherings of experts and activists and participants concerned about the state of democracy in the world, and where we discuss how to defend and promote democracy. And we're excited about that. This year, leading up to the Democracy Summit, we have a series of conversations, of which this is the first. Today, we'll be talking, as I'll say a bit more about in a moment, about the elections around the world. We really like, we focus, of course, a lot here in the U.S. and I suppose around the world on the U.S. election, but we really want to put this in perspective because there are trends happening across the globe of which the United States is really a part. So the first session today on that, and then on October 11th, rather, as you see on your screen, we'll have a conversation really about modern elections and especially about misinformation, disinformation, and the possible role of AI in elections this year. And then our third session will be shortly after the U.S. election, U.S. elections debrief. We may well be talking about legal challenges to the election. It's really hard to predict what the state of play will be at that point, but I can assure you it will be timely. And then finally, we'll have our summit. It's actually the end of the week of inauguration in the U.S., and so we'll be presumably in one of two worlds at that point. That one will probably be hybrid, some in person and some virtual as well. So mark your calendars; those are upcoming events. So today's topic: elections 2024. It's really the year of the election around the world. About half the world's population, 70 countries have held or will hold elections in this year. And of course, elections aren't the only measure of democracy, but the ability to have free and fair elections is central to the state of democracy. So today is a chance to talk about what has happened so far in the elections that have taken place, what the implications of those elections are, and what lessons we might be able to draw about the state of democracy given what we've seen so far. So that's the focus today. We actually have two sessions today. The first, which I'll moderate, a panel really of some of the leading experts who look across the globe to assess the state of democracy, a conversation about big trends in the world. I'm really looking forward to that, and I'll introduce the panelists in just a second. And then the second will be moderated by my colleague, Professor Nazneen Barma, which will involve some people who are really on the front lines of promoting and defending democracy in places around the world. So really looking forward to that discussion as well. So that's the agenda for today, and now it's my great pleasure to introduce our panel. We have just a great people here joining me to discuss today's topic. Dr. Yana Gorokhovskaia, who's the research director for strategy and design at Freedom House. Freedom House is, as most of you probably know, the oldest American organization devoted to support and defense of democracy around the world. It was actually founded in 1941 to promote American involvement in World War II, the fight against fascism. Timely history in a way. Dr. Seema Shah, who is head of democracy assessment team at International IDEA. International IDEA is an intergovernmental organization with a mandate to support sustainable democracy worldwide, based in Stockholm, Sweden, but operating in many countries around the world. And my colleague, Dr. Aaron Schneider, is a professor here at the Korbel School, University of Denver. Professor Schneider is a professor of comparative politics who writes about and follows issues related to democracy in various places, including in the Americas, Brazil, Venezuela, and in India and elsewhere around the globe. So welcome to the panelists. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Let's start with the big picture. So both Freedom House and International IDEA monitor the state of democracy around the world and produce annual reports. And for many years now, I've lost track of how many have been reporting on a general decline in democracy around the world. I wonder if you could say a few words, first of all, about what you do, what your organizations do, how you track that, and how you're assessing this year, 2024. Are the trends continuing? How are you seeing the overall health of democracy? And let me maybe begin with you, Yana.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here to talk about this topic. So just to step back a little bit, Freedom House does advocacy, research, and programmatic work. I represent our research branch, and that branch actually produces a report called Freedom in the World. We've been doing it for over 50 years now. The first one was published in 1973. Freedom in the World assesses now 210 countries and territories. And it does so according to 25 indicators that look at political rights and civil liberties. So everything from how free and fair an election was, to media freedom, to personal rights. And on the basis of that assessment, we produce a score for every country and territory. The score is out of 100, and that score translates into a status. And the status is free, partly free, and not free. And so the comments I'm going to make are based on that research. Of course, we're not done with 2024. We assess a whole calendar year. So our next report will actually be at the end of February. But I'm happy to make some general comments. Unfortunately, my first comment is going to be to correct a little bit of what Fritz said. We measure freedom, not democracy. So when the score comes out of 100, it is a measurement of freedom. And those two things are obviously connected. The logic here is, in a democratic system, people enjoy greater freedom. So I think that's intuitively understandable for people. But it kind of gets us into hot water when we have these conversations, because Fritz is entirely correct. 18 years of decline in global freedom, but it actually doesn't translate to decline in democracy globally. And so that kind of brings me to my first point, which is, maybe controversially, I'm going to say that democracy is actually pretty resilient, but democracies are a minority of countries in the world. And so that's kind of the problem we're facing. And in fact, of the roughly 44 national level elections that have happened already, more than half were not in democratic countries. And so, elections in places like Venezuela or Russia or Iran, it's kind of difficult to talk about the democratic character of those elections because they're inherently not democratic. There are various ways those elections are controlled, everything from candidate control to just outright fraud, things like that. So leaving those elections maybe to the side, looking at just what we would consider free countries or democratic countries, I would say in general, democracies are resilient partly because democracy is a self-correcting form of government. It's able to process conflict and integrate new ideas. But just because we don't see massive democratic backsliding doesn't mean there's not deterioration. And I'll say that the things that worry me specifically in democracies that challenge the quality of a democracy are things like political violence, attacks on the judiciary, and attacks on freedom of expression, both media freedom, but also freedom of personal expression, which is under threat by the proliferation of technology that governments use to surveil and censor people.
Right, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate that. Seema, I wonder what you're seeing and in what ways do you go at this differently perhaps than Freedom House?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a pleasure. We at International IDEA use a slightly different approach. We have a global quantitative and a global qualitative data set that we create and maintain in order to produce our annual Global State of Democracy report, which is coming out in 11 days on September 17th. And what we have found is that the latest data show that this is the 8th consecutive year of democratic decline. So net declines outweigh net advances for the 8th consecutive year. We chose to focus this year on perceptions of electoral credibility, so popular perceptions of credibility, to try and dig into what it is that's driving an apparent increase in public mistrust of election outcomes. And what we found is that looking at data between 2020 and 2024, we see that in about 1 in 3 elections, national elections, there is some rejection or public doubt of the result. So either through a boycott, a legal challenge, or a leader coming out publicly to reject the outcome. And we look specifically to see what the gap is between expert perceptions and popular perceptions, because as we know, even if it's not, quote, right, what the public think, those perceptions matter for legitimacy, and for legitimacy of the election, but also legitimacy of the elected government in the end. So I'll stop there for now.
I think really important, both of you made the point that the existence of elections is not necessarily either a measure of freedom or of the health of democracy. Probably useful to then sort of drill down a bit on some of the elections that have been taking place and maybe explore that idea a bit more. And Aaron, let me bring you in a bit. I know you follow elections in India, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, follow the elections in Venezuela and many others as well. Maybe you could say a few words, and I'll ask all of you to talk about places where we see, bright spots where there have been elections that evidence freedom or that demonstrate progress on democracy, and maybe those that are more problematic. So, your thoughts, Aaron?
Sure, thanks so much. And let me begin by saying how pleased I am and honored that I get to share the panel with folks like Yana and Seema and have a conversation with my dean, Fritz, and everybody that's logged in today watching. So as far as bright spots and challenges, I'll observe one bright spot in Latin America, in Guatemala. In 2024, we see the inauguration of a democratic center-left president who defeated a corrupt far-right project, and that project tried to bar first major challenges from the election, and then spent 6 months trying to prevent the election, the inauguration. The inauguration occurred in part because of international pressure, but mostly because the indigenous peasant majority of that country took to the streets and they blocked the various arteries of that country and forced the elite to acquiesce. So, you know, I take from this bright spot the observation that democracy lives where common people come together, demand that their votes be counted, and they offer a vision for a better future. And this is where I see, and thinking more generally about challenges, that in a lot of places, democracy has lost its sense of time. And what I mean by that is that the world faces this moment of economic, geopolitical uncertainty, and people are worried. People are worried about inflation, about precarious work, about climate change, about war, and authoritarians, those who oppose democracy, they acknowledge that hurt. And they offer a simplistic analysis and vision of time. And their analysis is that all this chaos, all this trouble, all this uncertainty is the fault of the African American, the gay, the immigrant, the feminist, the environmentalist, the Muslim. Whoever can be othered in each national context is the enemy that the authoritarians point to. And then based on that simplistic analysis, they offer a simple version of time. Also, that we need to go back. We need to go back in time to the past when things were run by men, by dominant religious groups, by white people, by imperial powers, and everything was in its place. So democracies need to acknowledge that people are hurting, and democracies are the ideal platform to debate that hurt correctly and come to real analyses of what's going on, and they'll offer a real vision of the future. And I think that's the challenge, is that democracies aren't doing that in too many places.
Let's pick up on those themes. I'm curious, maybe comment on Aaron's thoughts there, but also explore some other places. Maybe I'll come to you, Seema. You're based in Europe, obviously, or the organization is, and there's certainly been some very prominent elections in Europe, including most recently state elections in Germany, which are pretty interesting. But love to get your observations on both I suppose the bright spots and the things that worry you, either in Europe or elsewhere, as you look across the globe.
So the bright spots that we've seen recently in our data set include what Aaron just said about Guatemala, but also we saw a really inspiring story in Senegal earlier this year, where there was an attempt by the leader to stay in power, and the countervailing institutions in that country really sort of stood their ground and facilitated a transfer of power. And so that was really lovely to see. Also in India, there was a lot of skepticism about the ability of opposition parties to participate fairly. And the courts really kind of stepped up and made sure that there was room for fair opposition participation. And we saw the result, that the ruling party lost some of their overwhelming majority. And so now there is an opening. I mean, it's yet to be seen what will happen, but there is an opening, I think, for more space in a context that has really been damaged by suppression of civil liberties recently.
I'm curious. I don't know if you want to comment on what's happening in Europe, but it raises a kind of broader question, I think, about sort of the oddity of a kind of popular anti-democratic populism, the popularity of autocrats, and you see in Europe and elsewhere around the globe the rise of a kind of right-wing populism that, as Aaron suggests, is animated to some extent by the kind of tropes that he's mentioning. And I'm curious if you're seeing that in Europe or elsewhere.
So I think this is a really difficult question, because I think it's a little bit unfair to characterize an election like the recent German one as undemocratic. There's nothing undemocratic about it. It was a fair election. it sort of abided by the rule of law, popular will was represented, etc. Now what matters is what the parties that won do with their power. So if they sort of turn undemocratic or start dismantling the institutions that characterize a democracy, then we can say, okay, democracy might be in trouble. But I think so still it's too early to really say anything about the state of democracy.
Fair enough. Yana, your thoughts, either as you scan the globe for bright spots and worrisome spots, or more generally on this conversation we're having about the drivers of the trends that we're seeing.
Yeah, well, first of all, we don't like to consult other indices, but I'm always secretly happy when other indices bring up what I also think are bright spots. So Seema stole my comment about Senegal. Senegal, I think, despite the violence that happened last year, despite kind of all of the obstacles, it's a really a striking case of democratic resilience, and hopefully the new government can do more for the people there, because I think, as Aaron noted, there's a lot of questions around whether democracies deliver, and by democracy deliver, I think we mean in lots of different ways, in social policy and economic policy and in other ways. I think just kind of pulling back, I want to say that, one thing is that we often conceive of elections as a moment in time, but they're a much longer kind of process. First of all, elections often mirror the political system in which they take place, which is why we don't see a huge, surprise when elections are held in places like Rwanda. But also that election manipulation and distortion can happen well before the election, and also, as Aaron was saying, in the case of Guatemala, well after an election, right? So the election takes place, but then there's a lot of uncertainty whether the government can be formed. And this fact that elections are a long-term process, I think, contributes to this idea, Fritz, that you mentioned, that autocrats are popular. So maybe I'll just mention the case of El Salvador. There is a conception in El Salvador that Bukele, the president, is popular because he's been able to address the violence problem. But he is in a second term as president only because he replaced the entire constitutional court, which then allowed him to override the constitution and run for a second constitutionally prohibited term. He then, in the latest election, changed electoral rules in the same year that the election was taking place, which made it possible for his party to capture the National Assembly. So when you look at just sort of the facts on the paper, did he win the election? Sure he did. Did his party win the election? Absolutely they did. But were the rules fair? Were other parties given a chance? So I think sometimes, we think about popularity as sort of the kind of observable fact that the election was won by someone who has authoritarian tendencies. But the problem is that there's quite a lot of manipulation that takes place before the election is held.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. The election is just as a snapshot but very much the artifact of a whole host of other factors that determine whether there's anything approximating a free, fair election to begin with. I'm wondering, of course, in that context, highly prominent, at least in the U.S. right now, are the Venezuelan elections. And I wonder if any of you would want to comment, both about the extent to which this was problematic, and then I suppose in a way beginning to segue into questions about what we do about it. What are the vehicles that either organizations like Freedom House or International IDEA or other actors in the system can do when you have problematic situation, as I presume you would agree Venezuela is. I don't know, Aaron, you want to start us on that?
Sure, I can say a few words, and just thinking about Venezuela and the region where it is in Latin America. And in Latin America, there's sort of a couple of different patterns as far as where democracy faces challenge and how it is defended. One of those defenses is the sort of the left labor social movement coalition, which offers an alternative to those far right challenges in places like Brazil, in Guatemala, in Chile, in Honduras, in Colombia, in Bolivia. In other places, and or I should say that this happens in part because the far right has kind of squeezed out the center and made it into its subordinate partner. But there are other places where the center or the center right has, and this is kind of the pattern that we see in the U.S. and many places in Europe, where it subordinates the left and is able to come to power and stave off challenges for democracy, like in Uruguay, in Costa Rica, in the Dominican Republic, and Panama. But there's kind of the problem, which is that the center is equally willing to subordinate itself to the far right in places like Argentina and Ecuador and El Salvador, and you end up with that sort of erosion of democracy from within that was just described. In Venezuela, in Nicaragua, I put in the same category. The far left wins and then erodes democracy from within, in part because the right collapses and because pressure from outside has been ham-handed and imperial, and so that far left can harden itself and turn itself into the kind of authoritarian regime that we see in some places.
Yeah, that's helpful. Actually, I'm curious to sort of pick up the points you were making, but then come back to the point, Yana, you were making about, let's call them the sort of the warning signs, the precursors, the factors that inhibit or lead to an election that's far from ideal. What are the things that you look at as sort of the indices or the factors that really are kind of the warning signs about where in places where you see democracy eroding or you see undemocratic elections?
Sure. Well, I mean, I had a lot of hope for Venezuela, I think, as lots of people did, but I think looking at it realistically, even last year when the opposition primary was essentially, they ran the primary, but there was lots of attempts to kind of stop what was happening, including shutting down internet access so that people couldn't, because it was done sort of online. Then there were criminal cases against the winners of that primary, and they were actually so formally disqualified from running in the election. Then we saw an escalation where you saw then people who had organized the primary face criminal charges for the fact that they had organized a primary for the opposition. So I think all of those things would led me, to not be as optimistic about the outcome. And I think worryingly, what we're seeing right now is there is pressure from, the United States and also regional countries in the region, including what I think Venezuela likes to think of as potential partners or sort of ideologically aligned countries. But there is a counter support coming from places like Nicaragua. So the Ortega regime just recently offered to send troops to Venezuela. This Operation Knock Knock that's happening in Venezuela, which is just a mass arrests and also taking away people's passports so they can't leave. So those are all, pointing to a really kind of worrisome development. And we shouldn't forget that in previous elections, the U.S. government had also come out for the opposition winner, and that did not seem to make a huge amount of difference. So there are kind of precursors that we see. So, candidate control, trying to filter out the opposition, changing the rules. Those are all worrying signs. I think in countries that are, democratic countries where elections are free and fair, so where people have a choice at the ballot box, where they have supporting institutions, the things that really worry me are things like attacks on the media. And those attacks can be, take a shining example of democracy in Latin America, Costa Rica. So a vibrant media scene, but you have the president vocally attacking the media and actually having the courts come back and say that's inappropriate. And in other places like Poland, it's the destruction of public sector media, and then in places like Georgia, it's foreign agent laws, things like that. And that hinders people's ability to actually choose in an informed way between candidates. So in more democratic contexts, I think attacks on freedom of expression in the media are a huge warning sign for democratic decline.
Yeah. Seema, I wonder if you'd like to either comment on Venezuela or pick up on this theme of the media. It does seem, I think Ann Applebaum has a piece in The Atlantic just now, really highlighting the erosion of media as a sort of central warning.
Absolutely. Freedom of the press is one of the factors in our framework that we've seen experience the most dramatic declines and the most broad declines around the world. That, along with freedom of expression also. I think to pick up on a point that was made earlier about, what are the warning signs? In our data, we often find that there's this balance, right, in any healthy democracy between the power of the government and popular power over that government. So that's balance. That has to be in a balance. And once you start to see leaders kind of closing in on checks on executive control, along with civil liberties, that's when you start to worry because you're really concentrating power in a few people or just a select branch of government and suppressing popular control over their decision makers. And then eventually, if you let that go, then we start to see, okay, freedom of expression is declining, freedom of the press is declining, and then eventually that can have very real impacts on the ability of an election to be credible, to be free and fair. And then that sort of the tipping point is what we found. International IDEA doesn't work in Venezuela, but I think we, along with many other organizations that support democracy, would say, to pick up on a point that Aaron made about the danger of appearing or being imperial in the way that you offer assistance is really dangerous. So I think supporting the pro-democracy actors who are inside the country and already doing the work, and those are the forces and the groups and the movements that need support. And I think that would be the first sort of line of offense against anti-democratic movement or trajectories.
Well, I want to come back to that point in a minute because I do want to get to the question of where are the points of leverage in this? What are the ways in which organizations like yours and others can make a difference in that space? I am curious though whether we haven't talked much about. We mentioned Senegal, but we haven't talked much about Africa. Whether any of you see regional differences in what is happening in the world, or whether these are either systemic globally or really, in some sense, more kind of localized phenomena that really depend on the particular history of the country. I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that. I see Seema, you're nodding, so I'll pick on you first.
Sure. We do see some regional differences at a very kind of high level. You see that Africa struggles a lot with factors of representation, so credible elections, effective parliament, those things. In Latin America, on the other hand, we see representation scores staying kind of stable and relatively high. And there, the struggles have, the declines that we've seen most sharply have been in rights. So where you see freedom of expression, freedom of the press. We saw recently in the Mexican election, the amount of violence that characterized that election as really concerning. Whereas in Europe, we've seen some really traditionally high-performing democracies start to show serious declines. And I think that is really dangerous because we often hear a lot of pushback, like, why are you emphasizing or why are you paying attention to declines that seem relatively small in strong democracies? Shouldn't you be paying more attention to weak democracies? And what we would, I think, counter that with is, of course, it's important to pay attention to weak democracies that are getting weaker. But if you don't get in early, when you start to see a high-performing democracy decline, that could very easily the drop could become really steep really fast. And so it's important to act early.
Just so I could just draw you out really quickly on what you're seeing in Europe. Could you be more specific in terms of the things that are early warning signs in Europe?
So some of the factors of rule of law are declining a lot, like predictable enforcement. So basically, the degree to which everyone is equal before the law, and how predictable it is that laws will be enforced fairly and across the board in an equal way or an equitable way. We see that in lots of places, along with some of the other problems with effective parliament, so the degree to which parliament exercises oversight over the executive, and civil liberties, again, especially freedom of expression and freedom of the press.
That's helpful. Yana, I'm curious, if you see in your analysis of freedom, admittedly, regional trends, or whether it's, as I said, it's more globally systemic or more localized either.
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely see, we often do a breakdown of, as part of our reports, by population in different regions for people living in free, partly free, and not free countries in each region. And traditionally, Europe has the greatest population concentrated in free countries, followed by the Americas. And then Asia Pacific and Africa are on the tail end of that. I would say for Africa, the things that I'm concerned about are, first of all, coups. There have been, I think now 6 or 7 coups in the Sahel region since 2020. I think the coup in Niger was especially surprising in a lot of ways because, the government was democratic and it was popularly elected. It didn't seem like a fragile country. But we're seeing that these juntas are using the premise of violence and the threat of Islamist violence as kind of a pretense to seize power, and they're in fact not improving the security situation in the countries where they've taken over. But what they are doing is they're not holding elections and they're suppressing political rights and civil liberties. So that, I think, is really worrying kind of in the Sahel region and the surrounding region. Elsewhere, youth protests and this idea that we already talked about in terms of democracy delivering, I think is huge. We've seen protests in Kenya and Uganda, in other places. The sort of surprising but not surprising outcome in the South African election, I think, has a lot to do with whether democracy has been able to deliver, or that people feel that democracy has been able to deliver in that country over the last 30 years. So those are some of the trends in Africa. In the Americas, I think the trend that concerns me the most is also violence, but this time organized criminal violence. And we see that everywhere from Haiti to El Salvador to Ecuador to Guatemala. Mexico had a record number of assassinations of people involved in the election. So that's a really, in violence, I should say clearly, it affects people's rights directly by making them less safe, by infringing on a whole kind of slew of civil liberties. But it also infringes on rights indirectly because it's often used as an excuse for executive overreach. And we've seen that kind of around the world, including in places like the Philippines previously. So those are some of the trends. In Europe, more broadly, just picking up on what Seema said, I think that the degradation in democracy comes in sort of less noticeable forms. So one of the things we noted last year was an increase in corruption, and in surprising places like Norway. And so, this idea of kind of the performance of government and corruption, I think, is one that to watch in Europe. And honestly, also anti-migrant violence that we've seen spread from places like Cyprus to, England, Germany, and elsewhere. I think that it's a really challenging problem to address.
All right. Well, thank you for that tour of the horizon. Aaron, I know you described in a way the diversity within Latin America in terms of the dynamics, and but I'm curious whether you have thoughts across other regions as well.
Yeah, I think that in some ways, and if I thought through that framework a little bit in other regions. I don't claim to be an expert on all regions, and I think that one thing that you mentioned, that it does depend so much on what's happening locally in terms of the way in which things play out. I think that's accurate. In Europe, I found the French elections very interesting. In the face of a threat from the far right, you had this coalition of the left and the center right. And then, the institutional rules subsequently have left the center right sort of in power as far as the way in which the government is operating. The left is a subordinate coalition partner. And a similar sort of dynamic occurred in the UK, where the center and center right of Labour forced the left into a subordinate position and won. Although there, the far right conservatives had already pretty much collapsed by then. But this pattern of kind of center right and left, with left in a subordinate coalition, is what worked for Biden in 2020. And we'll have to see if it works in 2024 when there's no COVID and can't pin the inflation on Trump and this. So, I don't know if that same pattern of a center right subordinating the left to stave off the far right is out there. In other parts of the world, looking at India and South Asia and Asia. It's interesting there because I think that I think Seema observed that there was some hope in this last election in which the opposition performed better than expected. But what we see in India is that you've got this far right Hindu nationalist government and winning elections, and the opposition. The Congress has moved so far to the center right and attempted to subordinate the left that it's hard for it to present an alternative. It's that lack of a vision of the future that I was talking about earlier. So you don't see that alternative, that left labor social movement base that you might see. And in places like in South Africa and in Africa, you had decades after independence in which that independence movement, left labor social movement coalitions came to power, but then starting in the 80s and definitely in the 90s and 2000s, those governments had to implement, because of debt, because of structural adjustment, had to implement a center-right project. And this really muddles democracy because, what are voters looking at when they see parties and leaders that don't present the program, or don't implement the program that they were elected for. And so this is, I think what we see in lots of countries in Africa, where there's that muddle of democracy, that you don't have competing projects being debated within the democratic process. And then you have coups that become the way in which alternative visions of the future are presented. And that's, of course, a dangerous way to manage division and debate. And democracy would be a much better platform, but it wasn't functioning to serve that purpose.
A slightly different question. I'm curious. It's something that hasn't come up yet in our conversation, but certainly is central in American political discourse and a bit in Europe as well, is the assertion that there are actors in the world, typically Russia, China, maybe Iran, who are actively seeking through disinformation to destabilize democracies. And I'm curious whether that's a factor in any of your analyses of in terms of understanding what is happening in the world. As I said, it's very much on on the minds and in the political discourse in this country. Is that an important factor in what you're seeing in places where either freedom declines or democracy declines, or is, as the conversations has suggested so far, very much what we see a function of more local conditions? Anybody want to tackle that?
Maybe I can
Yana,
start,
yeah,
maybe.
but-
Sure. I think it's a really difficult question because I think, we're all social scientists here. So foreign influence is really difficult to measure first how much, and then also its impact, and then whether it actually matters in an election. I think we learned a lot since the 2016 controversy in the US. I think where we're on firmer ground is places like Taiwan. So Taiwan had an election very early this year. They were under very serious pressure by China, by the Communist Party. There was threats of military intervention that were quite open. There was also just a really active program of trying to sway voters that voting, for the party that sort of represented more of a rift with China would be dangerous to them. So this idea that voters were voting for war in that election if they made their democratic choice. So I think, and Taiwan has a really good immune system to that kind of interference, partly because they've been subjected to it for such a long time. So, I do think that foreign influence on elections matters. I think it matters to different degrees. There was some research we did earlier in the year looking at Germany and the role of Russian disinformation in Germany. That was, the purpose of it really wasn't to influence the election so much as it was to sow discord around continued military support and economic support for Ukraine. So the idea that this wasn't worthwhile, that why would you spend money on this? And also it did sort of align with the right-wing parties and that support, their closer alignment to Russia's view of the world. I think just very broadly, though, we should look at the influence and kind of soft power that countries tend to use. I do think it matters that China is giving loans to African countries. I do think it matters that Russia is sending mercenary soldiers to support the juntas in the Sahel. Those things, I do think it matters where Prime Minister Modi travels and who he meets in the world. So those things can't be, I think, undercounted, even though their impact is maybe not as direct as threatening voters or trying to kind of fool voters in a specific election.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't know, Seema or Aaron, would you want to comment on that?
I'll just say one thing, which is that I would echo everything Yana said, but also one of the things that I've heard recently is that sometimes when we focus so much on the threat of foreign influence or foreign disinformation and the influence that has on domestic politics, we lose sight of actually the danger of disinformation domestically. There's a lot of disinformation being spread around domestically in the US, but in lots of places that actually, because it's so hard to measure, we don't know, but that can have maybe more influence on politics than whatever foreign powers are able to do. And so I think it's important to just remember that. Yeah, so that's where I'd stop.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I don't know if Aaron, you want to comment on that, or perhaps we turn to pick up on a theme that Seema started, I think, to talk about, which is thinking about what can be done. What are the tools? What are the things that organizations like International IDEA and Freedom House, but many other organizations or indeed individuals can do to promote democracy or freedom? What are the things that seem to work? Aaron pointed to organizing and in the case of Guatemala, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about either from where you sit as an organization, as to what strategies are available for all of us and everyone listening to be defenders of democracy, promoters of democracy, promoters of freedom in the world. So I don't know, let me come to you first, Seema, on that one.
I think one of the things we're not talking about enough is that recently democracy, like for many years, working for a pro-democracy organization and, saying your mission is to promote and advance democracy around the world was fairly non-controversial. People were like, oh, that's great. Like there's nothing wrong with that for sure. Now it's controversial. It's in different parts of the world. If you say democracy, that comes with a lot of baggage, Western baggage, because it's seen the dominant model is a liberal model, which does not resonate with everybody the same way. And I think we really need to talk about it more. We need to validate other models. We need to give voice to the indicators that we don't tend to measure, the mainstream organizations, and hear what people think is missing and what they want to see a democracy reflect. I think that's one thing. And the second thing is, what I said earlier about figuring out how to support the forces and movements and people inside a country that are already doing the work and that know their context better than anybody outside can know it, and give them what they need and allow it to grow as organically as possible.
Love those points. What are the ways in which an outside group like yours can help groups that are on the ground?
So International IDEA does research, but it also does technical assistance. So for the parts of our organization that do technical assistance, I think that's where that kind of direct support to individuals or organizations or movements can happen. Those people that are working on the ground know who is in their communities that are doing that work. And so I think that's part of our mission, is to support them. And then researchers like us in headquarters can do sort of the research and analysis to support the kind of movements and the points that they want to make, so that when they're going up on a platform or when they're lobbying, an MP or something, they have evidence to back up what it is they want to say.
Mm-hmm. Oh, very helpful. Yana, you sit in a similar position in a way, similar perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be a little bit careful for a number of reasons. One is that we do work across the world, so I want to be cognizant of colleagues who are in dicier places than I am. I'm joining you from New York, where I don't feel personally threatened by anything, except maybe our subway system. But so I'll pick up on a couple of things that Seema said. So first of all, this point about working for democracy or human rights or organizations, we also have to be, so I agree, there's a whole baggage there, but we also have to realize that over the last 15 years, autocrats have worked pretty hard to give us a bad reputation. Definitely at home through a series of laws and smears and things like that, but also abroad, right? Challenging our credibility and our very legitimacy with other countries and other partners. So we do have to take that into account. We don't have to buy the narrative that we're all foreign agents or undesirable organizations or, some kind of Soros conspiracy members or whatever else. But we do have to take that seriously. We have to understand that. And part of understanding that is, as Seema was saying, working with the people who know best, which are the people in the country who are working for their own democracy and human rights goals, right? It's their agendas, it's their goals that we should be advocating for. And the ways we can do that is certainly assistance in country, but it's also about bringing those people and making the connections to policymakers, to media, to other civil society organizations, to other activists. It's about building that network that platforms people who are doing the work. And I'll also say that while people in the country are really important, we have to grapple with the reality that more and more countries are forcing their activists and their journalists and their dissidents into exile. There are places in the world where the majority of the pro-democracy movement exists outside the country. So these are places like Belarus, Russia, Afghanistan, and we have to think about what pro-democracy activism from exile in the long term actually means, because frankly, a lot of assistance programs are meant for short-term safety. So it's about pulling a person out for their safety for 6 months or, giving them a respite or something like that. But the reality is that some of these people will not be able to go home. So what does pro-democracy activism and what does human rights, the defense of human rights look like from outside of the country? And how can we help those people continue their work?
Very helpful. I know, Aaron, you tend to think about on the ground activists and movements. Do you have similar thoughts about the importance of essentially really supporting the sort of indigenous, the local actors on the ground?
Let me think about this question in two ways. One is along the lines of what you mentioned in terms of the actors on the ground, and the other is in terms of one international factor that we haven't touched on yet, which is sort of the multilateral actors. And on this, unfortunately, the record is somewhat spotty. International organizations don't tend to have their sort of their own sophisticated understanding of challenges to democracy in particular cases, and remain subject to the foreign policies of member states, and oftentimes the most powerful member states. And so you've got international organizations like the Organization of American States sometimes undermining democracy in places like Haiti or Bolivia, or failing to defend democracy, like when there was a coup in Honduras. In other cases, they just plain stay frozen and inactive in the face of clear attacks on democracies. And so the United Nations Security Council, the vetoes exercised by the US and by Russia, undermine oftentimes efforts to defend democracy, to defend international rules, to pursue peaceful, multilateral, equitable solutions to international problems. So at that macro or multilateral institution level, I think that there's a lot of work to be done. And then thinking about on the ground, how do we do it in a sophisticated way, aiding those democratic actors on the ground? And I think there's some mileage to be gotten out of understanding where the attacks on democracy come from. So in a place like Venezuela, in which a left government came to power democratically and then proceeds to undermine the institutions of democracy, then how do you push it back in the direction of democracy? And many times the response, at least the US response, has been, oh, we'll sanction or we'll intervene. But this strengthens those left autocrats against the members of their original coalition that might have pushed them towards democracy. So it's supporting those labor, social movement groups on the ground that would bring those governments back to what they originally elected to do, which was to be a left democratic government. Where the coalition is different, where it's that center-right coalition that gets elected, well, who are the democratic actors that can push them back towards democracy when they start to erode democracy from within? The US sanctions may have an impact. So in looking at South Africa under apartheid, that right-wing government, when sanctioned by the US, saw one of its support bases, those interests and actors that were connected to the US, being withdrawn. And so they responded by opening up. And so, the way in which you support and how you support democracy really does have to come with an understanding of where the threats to democracy come from and who are the actors that can push regimes back in a democratic direction.
Well, we are unfortunately just about at time. And we've hardly, we in some sense only scratched the surface. But I think what has been great is that we've really surfaced a lot of the dimensions of this, the factors that seem to be affecting democracy around the world. And now in this last conversation, beginning to think about the possibilities for intervention, and obviously a very complex topic, to be sure. We touched on something that will be the theme of our next conversation, which is really around information, disinformation, the role of the media in all of this. And so that conversation will take place on October 11th. We will today be followed by a panel of activists on the ground, and we're really looking forward to that conversation in a few minutes. But let me thank our panelists for very much for your insights and also for your work. It's really, really important work, and we appreciate both your time today and all the work that you're doing. So thank you to all of you. Thank you for all of you listening. We're going to take a 5-minute break now, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. We'll have a short video, and then we'll begin our second panel. So we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Welcome back to all of you in the audience who are part of our first panel. Really interesting discussion of the state of democracy and freedom around the world. Before we go to our second panel, though, I'm really excited to be able to announce a partnership with International IDEA, the Global Democracy Coalition, and the Club de Madrid on their Thank You Democracy campaign, which is it gives voice to leaders, activists, and experts who have a chance to say why democracy matters to them and why democracy matters more than ever. So let's move to our second panel, and very pleased with the real opportunity to hear from the voices of people who are on the ground, making a difference in the places where they live. The important work. We talked in the first session about the importance of helping people like this. So maybe we can get their perspective on what is actually useful from outside, but really pleased to have that discussion now with people who are on the front lines of the efforts to promote democracy. To moderate that discussion, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Professor Nazneen Barma, who is director of our Scribner Institute of Public Policy here at the Korbel School, and an expert on democracy around the world as well. Naz, good to see you. Thank you for doing this. I really look forward to this discussion.
Thanks so much, Fritz. Greetings to everybody here with us today. Good morning from Mountain Time here in Colorado. Apologies for our little glitch with the video there. Perhaps what we might be able to do is post a link to the video in the chat. And as Fritz said, we will try to ensure that we can share it, if not at the end of this session, certainly during our upcoming sessions that Fritz mentioned at the outset. So it was such a pleasure, Fritz, to hear the fascinating panel that you led earlier, just an hour ago, with Seema, Yana, and our colleague Aaron, giving us really kind of a macro overview of democracy and the state of freedom and democracy around the world, with great analysis of some key elections and this global year of elections. And Fritz, as you said at the outset of the panel, elections are the pivotal moments for democracy, of course, and it's really important to focus on them. But so much of what is required to really sustain and enliven democracy is the ongoing work of certainly political parties, which you all discussed, but also crucially of civil society organizations and grassroots movements, as you sort of came to toward the end of the panel. So here to help us understand, tie the macro picture that we spent an hour talking about to what's really happening on the ground is a terrific panel of three wonderful civil society leaders actually doing the work themselves on the ground. And it's my pleasure to introduce Daniela Arias, who is the coordinator of Laboratorio Electoral, which is based in Mexico City. It's an independent think tank that promotes investigation and analysis of democracy across Latin America. We also have with us Minhaj Jinnah, who is the executive director of My Vote Counts, which emerged out of campaigns by South African civil society aimed at addressing the hollowing out of South African democracy, and continues to focus on deepening democracy, public accountability, and social justice in South Africa. And our panel is rounded out by David Orlick, who is the co-founder of Anyone, an app for a 5-minute conversation with anyone around the world, geared toward unlocking networks that are typically closed by building platforms that increase access for underserved groups. And a large part of the work that David does is also based on democracy promotion. We have sort of a global tour, if you will, with us for this panel. Minhaj is based in South Africa. Daniela, I believe you're based in Madrid, but your work is on Latin America. And David is currently in Europe as well. It's a pleasure to have you all with us. Thank you so much for joining us. Minhaj, I don't know if you're able to join us via video as well. It'd be great to see you if that's possible. Terrific. Thank you so much. Let's kind of kick off the panel, if you don't mind, by kind of giving us a sense, overall of how the grassroots movements and local organizations that you all work with and lead in some cases have contributed to democratic resilience and indeed perhaps even transformation and deepening in your respective regions. And Minhaj, perhaps we could start with you, given the kind of South African election earlier this year. Tell us a little bit more about your work on deepening democracy from below and how it impacted the election, please.
Hi, Leslie. Thank you for having me. Maybe to start as a segue into what I want to say. As somebody living and from the global South, working on issues of democracy, the previous panel was quite bizarre. I don't think it was much of a it provided much for macro analysis, but rather a Western analysis. Many scholars on democracy in South Africa, grassroots activists in particular, will say that the sharpest decline in democracy in recent years is in the US. In the US, we've seen extreme political violence. You had an assassination attempt on a presidential candidate who at the time was probably going to win the election. You had an attempted coup after the previous election results, after the outgoing president rejected the election and continues to reject the integrity of elections. There's a huge potential of a fascist coming into power again, who has a commitment to undo democracy. I mean, I think that the internal, in addition to that, in the US, you don't even have the popular vote that elects a president. It's electoral college that elects a president. In many elections in the US, the popular vote didn't win. And I think especially important from a global South perspective is the role that the West, and the US in particular, as well as its allies, the UK and Germany in particular, has played in undermining democracies and continues to play in undermining democracies. In South Africa, where I'm from, Ronald Reagan, up until the end of the fall of the apartheid regime, supported the apartheid regime. Nelson Mandela, who Americans celebrate as a bastion of democracy, was only removed from the USA terror list in 2008. Right now, the US, Germany, and the UK actively supporting a genocide that has seen more than 40,000 people murdered. The US has supported coups in countries like Haiti, in countries like Chile, in Venezuela. In fact, we spoke about Venezuela in the previous panel. The US put in place a dictator in Venezuela and continues to bolster dictators in places like Latin America, in Africa, and other countries. My belief is that the biggest threat to democracy is the US and is the West, and I think we need to move away from this idea that the West is best when it comes to democracy. Democracy originated in the global South, and I think South Africa. I said it with a segue and a long segue. I think South Africa is doing quite well when it comes to democracy. We've had our elections this year, 30 years after the fall of apartheid, and the former liberation movement, the African National Congress, which is sort of a centrist party, lost power. Lost the majority of the vote and was forced into a coalition with people that it never agreed with primarily right-wing parties, and accepted it very, very maturely. And I mean, I think that's quite unique for post-liberation country, but also unique in the context of democracy globally. And I mean, I think this year we saw a realignment in our politics because of the election results. The ANC has been in decline for at least 25 years. And now the African National Congress has been not just a party in South Africa, but it's been a sort of a convener of society because of the role that it played in building coalitions since the 1970s. And the ANC in the early 90s built community movements, was in the churches, were in the mosques, were in community policing forums, etc. So the ANC has played a big role in the South African political imagination. And I think continues to do that. Every South African has some relationship with the ANC. And the ANC had a very serious decline in its power. I think even the ANC and nobody else expected that. The poll did suggest that the ANC would lose its majority, but not to the extent that it did. And I think there are many reasons for the decline in the ANC. In addition to the political context, we are also the most unequal country in the world. We are just recovering from 15 years of rolling blackouts because of an energy crisis, which we sort of coming out of now. We have one of the worst unemployment rates in the world. Almost 50% well, just about 40% of people who are able to work can't find work, are unemployed. That goes up to 65% when you look at young people. There are many other structural issues that South Africans face. I want to make one thing clear that I don't think anyone in South Africa said that this as a result, or this is the failure of the democratic project. I think what it is a failure of is I think one of the previous speakers spoke about the sort of capture of the politics of South Africa and the ANC, the labor movement by extension, being forced to accept right-wing, pro-business sort of policies.
Minhaj, if I may, I would just like to, I'm going to kind of come back to the point that I think you want to make, but the point that you just made, I think, about elite capture is a really important one. So I want to kind of hold on to that for just a minute and ask David and Daniela to come in on that as well. Certainly accept, the point that you made at the outset about sort of the perception of, in the Global South and from the Global South perspective, democracy as a Western imperial project. It's an important kind of topic for us to discuss. I think that in the earlier panel, Aaron sort of alluded as well to that perception in some of the context that he was discussing. And Seema, I think, made the important point at the final minutes of the panel that, in many parts of the world, the sort of notion of democracy promotion or freedom promotion can be controversial because it is perceived as a Western project. And so I wanted to turn to Daniela to kind of ask in particular about, the Americas, where this is obviously, a contentious sort of way to think about democracy. But to come back to that sort of, the initial question that I posed, which was to help us understand how in the context of the elite capture that Minhaj is discussing, how in the context of sort of global elite collusion around holding power in the Global South, how does the grassroots, how do civil society organizations kind of play a role, and why are they so crucial in the fight to defend democracy? Daniela, if I can turn to you for a minute. And Minhaj, forgive me for interrupting you. We'll come back to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And Well, local organizations are basic because, you know, the work that we do, it's definite, it's important for the communities because in Latin America, we try to stay together like in small communities, right? Latin America, the civil society organizations are relatively new because, you know, they have emerged as a response to changes in political and societal and in, you know, the societal like context we live in right now. The political parties are not responding, answering the needs of the people, and you know, the way they carry out their decisions is not enough for people, you know. Apparently they are forgetting why you know, our needs. And in Mexico in specific, civil society has reemerged during this government due to what they have considered to be attacks against democracy, against civil rights, against militarization. We have seen also attacks to the Supreme Court, to the National Electoral Authority, and the autonomous public bodies, which actually function as counterweights to the government. There have been some other incidents in the interactions between the government and civil society, but you know, the organizations have tried to organize themselves to manage to draw attention to these issues that we consider important, because it's not enough to just expect the government to answer all the questions. We apparently have to do a lot more than what we were taught to do.
Thanks, Daniela. I think, you know, something sort of that I'm taking from what you just said is that sort of so many of the threats to democracy come from within, right? Come from the people and the parties that we might have elected to power, and the sort of institutional structures that we have in place that can be, you know, at their best, checks and balances against authoritarianism, but at their worst can be manipulated in the service of a move toward authoritarianism, or a move at least toward diminishing democracy. Certainly, you know, we've seen sort of some echoes of that here in the United States as well. And I think, you know, your point is very well taken. David, you know, I would love to invite you to reflect on sort of how you see this sort of playing out in the European context and in which you're situated, and whether some of these same themes, you know, the kind of institutional kind of inability to address, you know, the kind of active threats that we see to democracy today. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you for hosting. And just to add some context to your presentation, I've worked with political strategy, been an advisor to the Social Democratic Party in Sweden through 2 general elections. So been following, witnessing, and working with the issues raised through electoral campaigns. I'm also the founding partner of a nonprofit called Järva Week, which is Sweden's largest platform for integration issues, which has grown into becoming the single lens through which all Nordic policy and politics are viewed currently, unfortunately. So going back to your question, the Nordic countries often pride themselves with this vast network of voluntary organizations that are said to be the foundation of a democratic society. Quick data point: in Sweden, we have over 200,000 nonprofit associations in a country of 10 million people. So the ratio is 1 in 50 people. And historically, you know, many of these organizations have been aligned with broader social movements. But more importantly, I'd argue that civil society has contributed to 3 things, and I think this is true in a European context. One is helping individuals build social capital. 2, creating a culture of mutual trust across society. And thirdly, educating large parts of the population on civic issues. Now, the challenges we face today, to a large extent in Europe, I would say, are the exact inverse of these benefits. A lack of social capital on the individual level, a lack of mutual trust across society, and a lack of education on civic issues, replaced by widespread frustration and a sense of hopelessness. So as it happens, these challenges are becoming prevalent in a time when the consensus is that civil society is in decline, and that nonprofit actors are under immense economic pressure. My point is that this is not correlation. This is pure causation. And the solution, of course, is an even stronger support of civil society on the ground and hard work towards a successful renewal. It's really an investment we can't beat with that.
David, thank you for that. It's really sort of interesting in terms of those three things: social capital, mutual trust, and civic education. Again, I think many of us from across the political spectrum in the United States would agree that those are the crucial sort of pillars and foundations of democracy. Let me kind of push you a little bit on this, because often when we talk about civil society, I think there's a sense of a homogeneity, right? That there's a group of people, often underrepresented, historically marginalized, and so on, who are kind of trying to amplify their voices in a space that has been closed to them. That's not the full picture, I think. There are, of course, other groups across the civil society spectrum. And one thing that has seemed to me, as a sort of not an expert on Europe, but just an observer, is that there are indeed civil society movements coming from across the political spectrum that sort of are doing all the things that you're talking about. Some of them have more sort of pro-democracy tendencies and others don't. And I would love for you to say anything that you might about that competition within civil society itself.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, civil society is not, per definition, progressive or ideologically leaning to one end or the other. I don't mean to push back, but often civil society does play that key role in providing marginalized groups with a space they lack everywhere else. So do you have any particular social movements in mind when it comes to the non-minority actors?
Well, I guess, thank you for pushing back. I appreciate it. That's what we're here for. But I think what I was thinking about was in the context of the French elections in particular, right? That there are certainly groups that support the far right, and not just in a sort of a party sense, which is one form of civic organization, but that you would kind of think of as civil society groups that are not on the progressive side of the political spectrum.
Got it. Well, I think I don't have an answer, but I have a reflection, and the reflection is that almost it's been half a century since the '68 movement, which I would argue was an important start of minority rights, a shift from a debate of majority rights to minority rights, and after decades of that discourse, I am seeing far-right movements internalizing and almost occupying that very same discourse and speaking as a minority. So we see that across Europe and especially in Sweden, which is in a very hopeless condition at the moment, where you'll have a majority movement acting like a minority, speaking like a minority, and demanding minority rights. And of course, becoming a growing part of civil society. This is just a reflection. I would say that is a symptom of something greater.
Thank you so much. Minhaj, let's come back to you and kind of keep teasing this out. I think you were sort of poised to tell us about some of the strategies that you and your colleagues have successfully been able to enact in the context of that sort of increasing, I would sort of say almost sclerosis of a strong institutional setup to deliver to the population and so on. So tell us a little bit about the civic action that you've been involved with in South Africa.
Okay, maybe I can answer that by giving two sort of case studies. So in the late 90s, about 6-7 years after the end of apartheid, when the HIV pandemic was prominent worldwide, and South Africa became, for many reasons, the epicenter of that. At the time, we had of course, the ANC was at its height of power. Their president was Thabo Mbeki, so this was after Nelson Mandela. The government took a stance of denialism. The government denied the relationship between HIV and AIDS, and therefore halted or stalled a macro antiretroviral program that would ensure millions of people's lives are saved. So civil society, through sort of historical networks, organized, mostly grassroots, mostly working class people, using the unions, etc., and build a movement that was called the Treatment Action Campaign. And I think this is important because the TAC set the standard or the benchmark for how movements are organized in the country. And the Treatment Action Campaign, most importantly in their tactics, realized or recognized that the vote is not the end of democracy. That democracy, and remember, this is only 7 years of South Africans experiencing democracy, that democracy gives citizens various tools to build power and to assent demands. So TAC used the courts, TAC used the media, TAC primarily used popular organizing, TAC used protests, shutdowns, etc., and eventually won, I think the most significant victory in the past 30 years of our democracy. And now we have, I think, the most robust and wide-reaching ARV program in the world. People's movements by the TAC ensured millions and millions of lives are saved. The other example that I want to use, which is a more current one, is that of a social movement called Abahlali Basemjondolo. Abahlali is a social movement of shack dwellers. I'm not sure I can't recall what the US equivalent is. People living in informal settlements, in informal homes, that on spaces that are occupied. So don't necessarily belong privately to people. So Abahlali represents those people. So people living in shacks. They have about 150,000 paid members. Abahlali has organized themselves for the past 10 years, I think, in opposition to the ANC. I spoke about the role that the ANC plays in the South African imagination. And in the past, I think 12 years, Abahlali has seen many of his members murdered by local political elites who are linked to hitmen. And they've been campaigning for housing, primarily housing and land access. Abahlali in 2014 decided to take electoral politics seriously. So beyond the type of organizing work they did, they decided to take electoral politics seriously, and they did what we're calling the tactical vote. So in 2014, Abahlali took a position through consulting their 100,000 odd members to vote for a political party called the Democratic Alliance, the DA. Now, the DA is in every way in opposition to Abahlali. The DA represents right-wing politics. He represents primarily white people, has an inclination towards the West, believes in a free market economy, etc. Abahlali is a socialist democratic movement. But they decided to vote for the DA because, in their words, the ANC is killing us. And that shifted power fundamentally in the province where Abahlali is based, KwaZulu-Natal, where the DA for the first time became the opposition in opposition to the ANC. Earlier this year, Abahlali took another position. They took a position to vote for the Economic Freedom Fighters. The Economic Freedom Fighters, or the EFF, are an authoritarian, kleptocratic, primarily Black political party. In many ways also are in opposition to Abahlali's politics. But what Abahlali did was they had a set of 20 demands, and they approached every party, and the demands were quite radical. Redistribution of land and things like that. And they approached every political party And they said that if you commit to taking these demands forward, we'll vote for you. And we means 150,000 people. We don't agree with you, we're lending you our vote. And the EFF committed to doing that. So what I think what Abatali presents, and the Abatali example presents, is it shows us that the vote in the South African context is just a tool to deepen and build people's power. And I think also, although the Abatali example is a prominent one, it's not unusual. I think South Africans since 1994 have been voting tactically in various ways. Just one more example, just to show that. One of the biggest shocks in this election is the emergence, although on a small scale, of ethno-nationalist right-wing politics nationally. And this was represented primarily by a party called Mkhonto weSizwe, led by Jacob Zuma, who led the state capture regime in South Africa. They received 20-something% of the vote. But a survey was done in KwaZulu-Natal, where they have the biggest base, asking voters why they voted for Mkhonto weSizwe. And voters said because the ANC is not delivering. So voters didn't necessarily agree with Mkhonto weSizwe's policies, but they needed to send the ANC a message. So the tactical vote is an important one to understand democracy in South Africa as well.
Thank you so much, Manhaj, for those really specific examples, and kind of, I'm kind of jotting down notes as well. I think you kind of told us about 3 different sets of things that I would love for Daniela and David to also reflect on. On the one hand, when you're talking about the TAC, you were talking about the sort of civil action, traditional things that that we know work, right? Sort of media campaigns, popular organizing, perhaps general strikes and civic action and things like that. Then you talked about the role of political violence and, the threat that many civil society leaders might face of assassination and political violence against these civil society movements. I think we've seen this in all of the different regions that we're talking about here. And finally, you talked about this very sort of tactical approach to using the polls, tactical voting, and so on. So Daniela, I would love to hear from you in your organizations, your analysis of sort of what goes on, across Latin America. Which of those tactics seems to have been sort of most successful, and which are the ones that travel across countries, that work in many different contexts, versus the ones that really have to be more tailored to a specific context? So if you have any, examples about that would be wonderful.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think, our main focus is electoral pedagogy. And for us, what people don't know, they don't know how to defend. If you don't know something, you don't know its implications and how it works. So for us, it's basic. Everything we do, it has this, like civil tone. We try to tone down everything because, politics and elections can be really technical, and they can be really difficult for the everyday citizen to understand. So we really think that pedagogy and civic cultures, participation in human rights, it's important. And I think that it also not only works in Mexico, but it works in every country, because of course, there's an incentive for you to not know what your rights are and how to make them count, because you are a person, you're a human being. So this helps to mobilize not only organizations but people, because when they start to understand what their rights are and how they are being threatened either by government or any other actor, they try to, okay, let's I don't know, let's train, let's focus, let's mobilize. The mobilization has been really important in Mexico and in practically every country in Latin America in the past years. Everyone, it's been, trying to understand why we are seeing these regressions, this going back to what we don't want to, these perversions of democracy. So yeah, we can, with mobilization, with electoral pedagogy, we can work this. Because actually it helps us to demonstrate the inconsistencies between what the government does and what it says, and not only the government, but every other political actor, how we can start to understand, okay, maybe there's something that's not right, something is not fitting here. And maybe it can helps us, mobilize and communicate the warnings about the setbacks in human rights and the separation of powers, which right now is the major threat in Mexico.
So let me just kind of ask you to dig a little bit deeper on that, the sort of, the importance of pedagogy and education and so on. How much of that is tailored to the particular groups that you might want to enlist into, sort of democratic action? And I'm thinking in Latin America in particular, it's certainly an issue here in the United States as well, thinking about indigenous rights and the indigenous, participation in democracy. How much of the work that is being done in terms of democratic activism across the Americas is targeting these groups that have been historically, unrepresented and less involved?
Yeah, well, for vulnerable groups, we have to actually make an extra effort because we cannot not do it. For example, this past election, the Electoral Authority creates these actions that promote not only the participation, but the actual election of people that are indigenous or maybe members of the LGBTQ community, or Afro-Mexicans, the people that has been, I don't know, maybe ignored by the government and by other political parties. And actually nobody knew about these actions that were taken by the Electoral Authority. So we made this specific infographics and this specific analysis explaining how they work. I mean, like the political parties had an obligation to to try to look for people that are indigenous and not actually try to I don't know, disguise them as indigenous, because this happens a lot. And also for Mexican, also for people from the community, LGBT community. So we had to promote for people to know it, to go to the parties to say, okay, I want to be you. I believe in your ideas and I am part of the community. I need to be included. And then we needed to understand how they did in the election, because the campaigns were difficult. We had a lot of electoral violence. It wasn't mainly focused on any other of these groups, but also because we actually got to know that there were people disguised as indigenous, disguised as Mexican, and they made it into office. Now they are trying to take that back in the jurisdictional authorities, but it still happens. So yeah, we have to make that extra effort to make sure that everyone knows what are the extra effort that the Electoral Authority is making. Why is these actions are being taken, and how to make sure that you are not being just included in a wrong bag.
Okay. Thank you so much for those details. Really appreciate that. David, I'd like to invite you to reflect on sort of anything you've heard from our co-panelists, but also to just sort of, you mentioned earlier the kind of the strategy and consulting work that you've done in a pan-Nordic sense. And I'm wondering, what has worked in that context again, and what are the things that might work in a Nordic context that might be sort of less successful, in a pan-European context or another contexts around the world. Thanks.
For sure. So I'd like to speak on the concept of lending your vote and tactical voting that was mentioned by Minaj, and I think it's applicable in a European context. Looking at the results in the European election, we need to ask ourselves why voter turnout was around 50%, and why a sizable number of those voting are moving towards the political fringes. One theory is that the desire for change is greater than the specific policies being sold by populist parties. Similarly, the lack of trust against established politics is, I guess, greater than the commitment or belief in certain populist ideas. There was some interesting polling data from Data Praxis that really led me to believe this theory strongly. So what we have in the European context is one group of people that are disenchanted and desperately looking for change anywhere they can see it, and then another group that shows up and votes against them because they don't want fascism. That is not a constructive place to be. So what we're seeing now in a Swedish and European context is a call for radical centrism. There was an article published by Daniel Sachs in Politico a month back presenting this topic and idea. It's still in its infancy, but in short, the idea of radical centrism is something that opposes populist mimicry from an established point of view, and it promotes innovative policy and new political leadership. Being an optimist for 5 minutes, I believe that we're going to see more of that.
So very interesting. And I think, listening to Aaron Schneider from a little bit earlier, he was also describing this, in a sense, the move to the center after a long period in Europe, after a long period of, a move to the extremes in the UK, perhaps in France as well. I think, to kind of come back to something that Minhaj was saying at the very beginning, sometimes these kind of heavily centrist, institutionalized approaches to governance start to take on a technocratic feeling that is not as inspiring or as exciting for people in terms of their democratic participation. So there's always a pendulum. That's sort of, my experience of this. But I'd like to ask you, David, just to say a little bit more about thinking about the European context, and in particular, the Southern and Eastern European context, where for a while, 10, 15 years ago, there was this whole series of the color revolutions, right? As kind of these countries were kind of coming into the democratic wave and so on, where they were clearly learning from each other the tactics that had worked in different contexts and importing those lessons into these democratic movements. I wonder how much you see that type of learning across organizations between countries happening now, again, in the pan-Nordic context, but kind of perhaps spreading across Europe as well, or whether the need is really for more unique approaches depending on the specific context.
That's an excellent question. Reflecting briefly and broadly, the events you're referring to, I would say, were very much a part of a political discourse in the 2010s, which stemmed around very hopeful narrative anchored in social media, which then took to the streets. I would argue that we today live in a radically different paradigm, where hope is not a feature of it. Aaron mentioned that these populist movements often look back from a temporal point of view, and in a way they mourn the loss of the past. Looking at civil society and looking at a lot of youth movements, I can't help but feeling that they're mourning a loss of the future. Like, I'm from Sweden, where Fridays for Future originated from, and a huge part of their discourse is the idea of their future being robbed from them, having lost the future, and the future having already happened in a way, with the climate crisis discourse and the technological discourse weaved together. There's not much space for parliamentary politics to actually bring about a change. So I would say that is a key difference today compared to 10 or 15 years ago. There's this broad notion that the future has already happened, which brings around feelings of, again, frustration, anger, and hopelessness rather than constructive organizing and change making.
No, thank you so much for that fabulous point about the sort of existential, crises that we sort of find ourselves placed in. We've got just a couple of minutes here. I'm going to turn it back to Fritz, and I think hopefully we might show the video as we wrap up here. I want to just ask each of you to take 1 minute, if you will, to tell us what you think, looking ahead, to end on an optimistic note, sort of what some of the bright spots are, in that you're seeing as you kind of survey the landscape. Minhaj, you literally have the future of democracy in your hands there. Pleasure to see a baby on your lap, but tell us what you're seeing as the bright spots looking ahead.
Yeah. I think in South Africa in particular, it's optimistic. I think that the realignment of our politics is crucial. It does present something that's extremely important, and I think that's the case for many other countries. There's a hole in our politics. So in South Africa, there is no, for example, left political party that represents the ambitions and needs of working class and poor people. I think the other optimistic thing globally is what Palestine has presented to us. I think the Israeli genocide in Gaza has shown the ugly face of the West, the US in particular. And the West's kind of rejection for democracy and for people beyond themselves. So I think many people in the global South, we saw this with South Africa's ICJ case, are seeing that and are organizing amongst themselves. So I think that does present something that an element of optimism.
Great, thank you. I think your point about democratic ambition is a really wonderful one. Daniela, how about for you? Any bright spots that you see in the Americas in particular?
Yeah, I believe that we do have a little hope still. Actually, we are seeing this regression of democracy, but we are also seeing this pushing towards like the rejection of that regression, specifically from women and vulnerable groups. We are going to be the ones that are going to be more badly hurt by these decisions. So I think that there's hope, and there's hope in women and in youth and Afro-Mexican and Afro people who've been fighting for their rights, and they are not ready, and they are not going to go back. So yeah, for me,
a real sense of deepening inclusion. Right. Thank you. And David, how about you? Any bright spots for you?
Of course, building on that, I think a go-to strategy from a civic point of view needs to be what we could call role model production, just supporting leaders from local communities and doing everything we can so that they can take on roles of leadership in politics, business, and civil society. I think that is the only way to move forward.
Wonderful. So I heard ambition, inclusion, and bringing in, role modeling, new leadership. Those are the ingredients indeed of what we hope will be democratic resilience moving forward. So on that more optimistic note, Fritz, thank you so much to our panelists, Minhaj, Daniela, and David. Really been a pleasure having this conversation with you. I'll pass it back to you, Fritz.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. And thank you, Naz, and thank you, Minhaj, and Daniela, and David. That was for a very thoughtful conversation, including reminding us that we have our own problems here in the U.S., which of course are very much on our minds and will be topics of future conversations for sure. As I mentioned earlier, please, this is the first in a series of conversations. So the next one coming up, now on the screen, is October 11th. We'll pick up on some of the conversations that we were having today, but go a little bit deeper in terms of information, misinformation, possibly the role of AI in elections going forward. Thank you all for being with us today, and we hope that you'll join us for the conversation on the 11th and subsequently in November and in January as well. We do have the video. Apologies again for the technical difficulties. So I'll just say thank you, and we'll sort of sign off. And if you have time, it is a very engaging video with the voices of many people. Anyway. On that note, thank you all for being with us. Thank you for all you are doing to promote democracy.
Why do you stand up for democracy?
Well, because it's like oxygen.
It allows for expanding freedoms, rights, and liberties across the world.
I am thankful for democracy because it protects my rights.
Because democracy allows me to express my opinion.
There are certain guarantees in democracy that allows us to express our liberty and freedom at its fullest.
It allows me the agency to have a voice in how my own country is run and governed, even when things aren't going well.
Because it keeps me safe.
It actually gives right to the people. It actually makes people's voice to heard.
It's our responsibility to fight for our democracy, not only for us, but also for the coming generations.
It's essential for addressing global challenges and safeguarding human rights, making it crucial for our future.
Democracy, it's about having a possibility to drive positive change. It's about holding leaders accountable, and it's about ensuring that the rights and the needs of everyone, and especially young people, are represented and are addressed.
The opportunity for us to be able to actually exercise our rights as voters and elect the leaders that represent our own interests.
This is the time when all of us who care for democracy must speak up and stand up for democracy so that it may continue to flourish. Democracy is the only guarantee for individual freedom and for the defense of human rights. Because if you don't have dignity to vote, to express yourself, then what's life?
Because it empowers me to have a voice in important decisions that directly shape my life.
In order for us to live in a peaceful world, in a collectively safe environment, there is no other way than standing up for democracy on a daily basis, whether you are from an authoritarian regime or if you are from a democratic country. We have to stand up for democracy all together.
Equality and freedom.
I'm thankful for democracy because it lets me be free.
It promotes inclusion of diverse voices in decision making.
I stand up for democracy because I think it's the right value to defend nowadays in the context of uncertainty. And always, it has been proved that it's the best system we have.
Democracy serves as the cornerstone of a digital era that is inclusive and equitable.
Because it offers the freedom in which people can live meaningful lives and participate in bettering the lives of others.
In our democracy, the youth have the power to contribute to the future we want to see.
I'm thankful for the many opportunities that I can pursue without fear of consequence for myself or my family.
Well, I grew up in a dictatorship where we didn't have freedom of expression. So I'm really thankful for democracy and the freedom that it brings to self-expression.
Because I can speak freely, I can make my own choices, and I hope one day everyone can do the same.
I'm thankful for the opportunity to speak freely.
So the freedom of expression. Because in democracy, young people and women are real decision makers.
Because I can have a voice in my own government and influence policy without being an active member of government.
Our kids, future generations can live and have a good, safe life.
Cada generación tiene que hacer su propia democracia. Democracy is the right system to follow, is the right system to strengthen, is the right system to spread it around the world. That's why, for me, all of us, we need to support, to promote, and to protect the democracy.